Or oksami, doing my third breakdown for the June 22nd Kenny Beats battle, and we'll just get right into it. So the workflow ends up being pretty much the same as the first beat battle, where I focus on the drum groove first, then the sample, then instrumentals, and then try to rearrange and mix a little bit. So for the drums, we end up using decap drums that knock. So we then go to the hi-hats, which now we can introduce some humanization by adding some swing. From the Cashmere pack, I use a little shifted clap that sounds like this. When you go to get it a little bit off grid, you end up getting this really cool sucking effect into the snare, and overall just making your drums a little bit more interesting here. Next up, we take a look at the sample. So this is the original sample. As you can tell, the quality is pretty bad, and Kenny described it really well. It's like this good yet bad sample because the content in it is really, really interesting. And whenever you have something with this sort of vocal timbre, it's always usable. And I end up chopping up this loop here. To do this, I use a pretty aggressive EQ curve. You can see I try to cut as much out of this 100 to 200 hertz region, and then I have a little dip at 1K. This was added in later to make room for the vocals a little bit. The second thing I put on it is this thing called OTT, or Over the Top, which is a preset in Ableton's multiband compressor. It basically squishes the sample a ton. It tames the mid-lows really well and brings out the highs a bit more. You often want to use this at not 100% wetness because it's a really powerful effect. Next up is the instrumentals. I end up using a guitar to start off writing. You should really try messing around with different instruments as starting points because some chord progressions and licks sound better on different instruments. You might notice that it's actually out of tune in this latter part, which I'll play. There's some low and mid notes that are actually not in key. So this is actually okay. We will use this technique, which I'm pretty sure has a better name. I'm gonna call it harmonic suggestion. And it's the idea that when you have a more defined chord structure or more defined instrument that's playing this lick, you can kind of guide the ears in a way into thinking that everything else is in tune. This sample's close enough. It's basically in that borderline where your ears can basically be tricked into thinking that it's in tune. We'll move on to the bass. This is just a Rickenbacker. This ends up having, I guess, very little processing, a little compressor on it. And again, OTT, which ends up bringing the highs out a little bit, so. Now onto the leads. At this point, with the sort of sound palette getting more defined, I sort of had an idea of what I wanted to use as leads, including an electric guitar, a flute, and some soul runs to try and accent the phrases. So we'll talk about the flute first. I end up using the Swam alto flute. It uses like a synthesis engine to create these really realistic flute sounds. The only thing you do need is an expression controller, which is this MIDI signal that tells how loud the flute should play. For me, I end up using this really silly looking thing. It's called a breath controller, and you basically blow into the mouthpiece and you bite down to adjust the vibrato. So if I play a quick lick like this, have a very natural velocity curve because it is your breath. It's like you're actually blowing into a flute. The electric guitar is going to be another preset in this sample library called Evolution Stratosphere. Yeah, very little processing. I have a small compressor and some stereo on it, EQ to make room for other elements. This is an acapella done by this really talented vocalist named Naji. Found this specific acapella, kind of just dragged it in, and it just instantly clicked. And with the whole track together, so to start off the final touches, which is this mixing and arrangement process, I basically break the track into 4 bars at a time, ask myself, what are the key elements here? What's the main idea? It's always going to be the chorus that I look at because it's sort of the hook and the strongest part of the song. And immediately, you know, the vocals are wanting to be in center stage. The most conflicting element was the original sample. I don't want to get rid of it entirely, but there are some clever things you can do to make sure it doesn't fight as much. One of them being widening it so that it occupies the stereo space a bit more, and they can kind of occupy the same frequency spectrum and not sound like they're fighting. And then the second one, if you always need that extra push, I use this VST called Track Spacer. You can basically sidechain the vocals into this, and what it'll do is it'll duck the frequencies that are conflicting only when the vocal's playing. The next major part that I had to mix was the solo section at the end. So whenever you have multiple leads trying to fight for space, you have a few options. One is to let them harmonize. The second is to utilize what I call horizontal space and do this call and response. It's sort of a small example of how arrangement and mixing do go hand in hand. All this EQ, all the gain staging are kind of the last ditch efforts in a way for you to express that idea. Because if you arrange well and you have a clear idea of what you want to show at each section, there's really not much you need to change. That's it for this song. I'm honestly so overwhelmed by all of the warmth and support in the Kenny Beats community. Thank you so much, Kenny, for hosting these. For awesome reactions on stream, and for the OPZ, which I'm super excited to try out. If you'd like to see more breakdowns, I recently did one for my song Cityscapes, which is part of my With Regards EP. Until then, I hope you're staying inspired, and I definitely look forward to making some more content.